Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Authors and Agents with Rose Quinn. I have a literary agent on the podcast today. Woohoo! I know you guys adore these interviews, and I have Hannah Brattesani with me today. Hannah tells us a little bit more about her, why she loves being a literary agent, a misconception that people might have about her job, and gives some really good query advice. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy getting to know Hannah. Hannah, can you tell me a little bit about what drew you to publishing and becoming a literary agent?
Yeah, so I think that my story probably won't surprise anyone, and it's probably an answer that you get every time you ask this question. But my mum is an avid reader, and she always has been. And so she instilled this love of reading and writing in me at a very, very young age. I remember reading during the day, and I would fall asleep to audiobooks on CD at night, and they would range from anything to like Nordic folklore to Grimm's fairy tales to Judy Blume as I got a bit older, and Jacqueline Wilson. And my dad, he's more of a sporadic reader, but he is a storyteller. He has one ghost story that it involves a ring, a corpse, and a missing finger. And he's told it to me and my sister so many times. And each time it's a slightly different iteration. And he kind of has this gift for hearing a song or spotting some detail when you're out somewhere and being reminded of a tale that he heard about a person, or that person. And so I think I grew up knowing that stories are important. They're important to me. They're important to my family, and they always have been. I graduated university knowing this, and knowing that I wanted to work with books in whatever capacity was afforded me. I also knew that I wanted to be in New York, so I got to work trying to make that happen. I was lucky. I got an internship right out of uni at a boutique literary agency on the Upper East Side. And I didn't fully understand the role that literary agents played in the industry, but I was excited to learn. And, within a couple of days, it started to feel like coming home. I worked for 3 intelligent and formidable women and 2 dogs. And I knew very quickly that this is something that I wanted to do.
That's awesome. I do think that is part of the answer that I always get is, I've always been an avid reader from a young age, like loved books, because I think to be a literary agent, I mean, obviously you love books. Like that is why, you're in this crucial role that you get to fall in love with these stories and help mold them and then bring them out into the world. So wonderful. And I love that, you had a very eclectic tastes, your parents did growing up.
Yeah,
you got to read a lot of different things.
Kind of unexpected. And you can definitely blame my parents for it. It's hard now to kind of pin down my taste, and I think it's their fault. You can blame them.
Yeah, we'll blame them for that. There's nothing wrong with having, a taste for a little bit of everything too, I think. Because I write like murder mysteries, crime fiction, but I love to read anything. Like I'll read fantasy, I'll read sci-fi, a lot of different things, because reading in general is just the best, no matter what it is.
Yeah. A good story, once it's got its claws into you, there's no letting go.
No.
Regardless of the genre, there's something about a good story that can kind of hold you there and keep you on the couch, even when it's getting dark outside. I love that experience. I love losing myself in a book and, kind of losing the day to it, and waking up kind of after it, realizing that you're back in reality. And I think when you mourn a book, when you finish it and you realize that you miss it, that's a brilliant reading experience.
Oh, yeah.
And that's all to do with a story. It's the power of a good story.
It is the power of a good story. I have lost myself in many a book and just sat and read. And then I'll be like, oh, I've read that book in 2 days or in 1 day. But then I'm heartbroken. I'm like, I want to go back to the first, before I even read it and experience it all again.
Yeah, there's nothing like that first read.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing.
No.
And you can try and recreate it, but you'll never get it back.
No, you won't. Unfortunately, we got to savor those first reads.
Definitely.
Well, my next question is about queries. And, part of these agent interviews that I do, people love to get different agents' perspective on the querying process and all the kind of parts that go into that. So my question for you, I'd love to know what some of the best queries you've read have had in common.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is great comparative titles, titles that show an awareness of the current market and give me a clear idea of voice and where the author thinks their book should sit on the shelf. And I think that clear is really the operative word here. The best queries, for me at least, require little clarification. I know immediately what the book is about, who the author is, and why they would like to work with me in particular.
I think that is such great advice. I think great comp titles can really show that a reader has done their homework, is familiar with the industry and the genre that they're writing. They're not, just somebody who's like, oh, hey, I'm going to send out a bunch of blanket queries. They've invested in it and they've done some homework.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm always impressed when I try to be as active on Twitter as possible and give a good idea of what I'm reading and what I'm enjoying, which is actually harder to do than it should be. But I do try and give a good idea of what I'm on the lookout for. And I'm always very impressed when an author comes to me from that and says, oh, I saw you were reading this. Well, I've got a book for you. And I love that. I love when someone has kind of recognized what I'm enjoying and sees that in their own work and they query me about it. I love that connection and that kind of personal touch.
Oh, I think that can be so beneficial. I think that, a lot of authors, and I have felt this way at times with querying too, like you dread the process. You're like, oh gosh, I'm gotta get ready for all this rejection. But I think going into it, doing homework, paying attention to agents that you want to query, and then finding something like that, if you can, a personal connection or, something that that they're looking for, really pays off in the end and can help maybe shine a better light on your query.
Definitely. I think it sets it apart. Just that personal touch, that little bit of research beforehand goes a long, long way.
Yeah, it does. It adds on to the process. And me as an impatient person, I'm like, okay, let's speed this up any way we can. Even though knowing, yes, it is so important to do that research. My next question is about a synopsis. How important do you think a voice is in a synopsis that's sent to you?
So the short answer to this is yes. I think voice is important. I think that all components of a query letter should be a reflection of your manuscript. The long answer is that I'd actually rather read a pitch than a synopsis, and there is a difference there. I don't need to be taken through every action that occurs in your narrative. I'd instead like to be persuaded to request your manuscript and learn what happens myself. There's always the kind of risk of a synopsis that you rob the agent of an opportunity to discover your book as a potential reader would.
Right. I agree with that. I hate writing a synopsis for my book. So part of me is like, oh, maybe I'll just stick to the agents who don't require one. But I think that there is something to be said. And I'm not an agent, but I could imagine, being able to read it like a reader would and to be surprised and feel the twists and turns without knowing them beforehand would be special.
Definitely. And I think what you really want to do as an agent, I think, is experience the book how an editor would. How, when you do eventually go out in submission with this book, how are they going to digest it? You're not going to, as an agent, give them the synopsis. You're going to invite them to read this book, entice them with a description and a pitch over the phone. And I think I need that experience too when I first read a book. I want to be invited into it. I want to experience it how an editor would experience it. I want to experience it how the eventual reader, when it hits the shelf, will experience it. And so that's important to me, that the query doesn't answer every question. I get to discover those answers for myself.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And yeah, I mean, the real purpose of querying is the query letter to reel you in, to make you curious and want to read more. I mean, that's what we're all trying to do.
Yes.
Well, I love it. Well, my next question is, before an author starts to query, do you recommend hiring a proofreader or an editor to go through their manuscript?
So I think it's important to note that an editor is not a resource that is available to everyone.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't broadly recommend it, no, but there are scenarios where I think authors could benefit from an editor's input, but it's certainly not a prerequisite for querying me. However, I can't understate the value of a beta reader. Writing can be an insular and often lonely experience, and the ability to get a second pair of eyes on your work can alleviate some of that feeling.
Oh, yeah.
It could be someone you trust, someone whose opinion you value, a friend, a family member, maybe joining a writer's group offline, not currently, but or online, and trying out your manuscript there. I mean, failing that, there's always the dog, and that's only kind of a half joke, because I think that there's a value in reading your manuscript aloud, whether there's a pet present or not. There's something about just giving voice to your words and hearing them out in the world, and you get a whole other feel for it. So there's value in that too, reading aloud. I think to a dog or a cat or just an empty room.
Yeah. I've heard some authors say that they read their whole entire manuscripts aloud, and I'm like, I just don't have the time for that. I mean, that seems like it would take forever, but I have picked, like passages or, problem places that I do read aloud, and I think it is super helpful. And I think with the wonderful writing community that's out there, you can definitely find a beta reader or someone to help give you some critiques online in this day and age. Some of my best beta readers I've never met in person. I've just connected with them through the internet, and my husband was telling me yesterday, like, those aren't real friends, you've never met them. I'm like whoa, hold the phone here. Like, these are some of my best friends, and I've never met them.
Exactly. I think it's important to cultivate a community around you as a reader, because, like I said, it's a really lonely experience.
Yeah.
And it's a vulnerable one too. It's you're putting something that's been incubating inside you for so long out into the world and onto a page, and having someone you trust, someone who you just love talking books with or talking manuscripts with, to weigh in and give you their opinion is so valuable. It's priceless. It's an experience that I think all authors should try to have. I
think so too, and I love that you said it's priceless. And there are people who would charge lots and lots of money, but the fact that we have this great community where people are willing to devote their time to do this for free is really special. I mean, it's one of my favorite parts of reading is beta reading and then falling in love with stories. And I'm like, I want to tell the world about them, but they're not published yet. They're not real books.
It takes some restraint, right?
It does.
It's really hard not to geek out about something that only you know about.
Yes.
And that's actually really hard as an agent, because you've known a book since it's since it was tiny, since it was a first draft, and you kind of want to talk to everyone about it, and eventually you're going to exhaust them, and you'll exhaust them before the first publication. So you have to hold back. There's restraint in that. There's a lot of restraint.
Oh yes, I see the vague, excited publishing tweets all the time of people trying to hold back on the information they have.
Exactly. Restraint just kind of translates into vagueness.
Yes.
Because you can't give details, but I just have to gush about this book.
Right.
So it just becomes a very vague, meaningless tweet, but I guess it alleviates some of that urge.
Yes, you get a little bit of it out.
A little bit, yeah.
Well, my next question, I'd love to know, what's a big misconception people have about what you do as a literary agent?
The biggest misconception is that I read all day. I wish I could read all day, but my workday is filled with answering emails, various admin tasks, meeting editors, getting on Zoom calls. It's not until I've wrapped up for the day that I can finally settle in with a manuscript and a cup of tea. If I could do that, during the workday, it would be a dream, but I can't. I also think that there's a misconception that I've read everything. I've come away from a few awkward conversations where I've been introduced as a literary agent or done so myself, and the person I'm speaking to begins to talk about a prominent author in a genre I don't read or represent. And in situations like that, I kind of relapse into, Brit mode and talk about the weather. And it's not really a subject that I want to discuss, and it's definitely not something they want to hear about. But talking about the rain is easier than explaining why I didn't read The President is Missing, for instance.
Yeah.
But there are a handful of almost supernaturally gifted agents. I currently work for one whose intimate knowledge of books spanning the past 5 decades is infallible. But, us mortal agents, we are fallible. And this is really, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but I only read Sally Rooney for the first time this year. And that's an almost blasphemous confession in publishing. So I hope by saying it out loud, I've kind of absolved myself of some of that publishing sin. But we are fallible. And I haven't read everything. I think there's genres out there that I am not knowledgeable on whatsoever. And I don't expect to be knowledgeable on them anytime soon.
Yeah. I think those two go hand in hand. People expect you to have read everything because all they think you do is read, right? Like, they think you're a professional reader, that you just sit for however many hours a day and read everything that gets sent to you. But, that is one I've heard commonly, and I think that plays into part with, like, the slowness that can be the publishing industry when, an agent or an author has sent you a full, or, an R&R and you get the full back. Like, I think there's slowness there, which is to be expected because you have so many other things to do and things on your plate. But we as everybody behind on the other side of the agent spectrum, we're like, well, they should just be reading it right now, right? Like, what else do they have to do?
Yeah. And it's funny, there's a phrase that I use that I've heard editors use, and one of my authors actually pointed it out to me. An editor said it to them, and they're like, that's what Hannah says to us all the time. And it's that publishing is a slow-moving ship.
Yes.
It just is at every point in the process. It's slow getting through our query inbox, just because of the volume, and because of what it requires of you. And it's slow once it gets to the publishing process too, because there's so much involved. And that's tough sometimes because we're also impatient, and we want to see this beautiful book on the shelf. We want to hold it in our hands. We want to gush about it on Twitter.
Right.
But it takes time. It takes a long time. So yeah, it's a slow-moving ship. That's what we say.
Yeah, it is a very slow-moving ship. And then you're stuck in part of the ship in the dark, and you don't get to control everything or see what's going on behind the scenes.
This is true. Yes.
Well, kind of on this vein, what is the hardest part of your job as a literary agent?
The hardest part of my job is saying no. I recognize that writing a full-length manuscript is an accomplishment in itself. And I want every author, published or unpublished, querying or not, to be able to celebrate that massive achievement. And there are only so many manuscripts I can take on, and I have to be selective. That's really, really hard.
Yeah.
I'm lucky in that I've only had one manuscript that got away from me so far in my career, but I know that there will be more. And that's always a thought that kind of lingers when I'm reading queries as well.
I think that is a great thing for you to say, because I think that there are those who query and they hear no so many times that it hurts. I mean, no matter what, because it is such a thing to write a whole entire book, and to send it out there, to be so vulnerable with yourself, to let other people read it and be like, hey, do you want to love this book with me too? But it's not fun on the agent side to say no, and it's not like you're saying no to be mean. You just have to take into consideration a lot of other factors that go into it.
Exactly. And I recognize that writing, and I said it earlier, it's a really vulnerable experience.
Yeah.
You've, you know, not only have you devoted so much time to this work, you've devoted just energy and love, and you've sacrificed a lot of other things to put together these thousands of words on a page in the hope, in the small hope that it will one day turn into a book. And I think that requires a lot of a person. And so just getting to the end of that first draft is a huge, huge accomplishment. It is. Even if it never ends up on a shelf. Yeah. I think you should take a lot of pride in that.
Yeah, and I think as authors too, you learn something from every single, draft that you complete. Whether it stays on your shelf or under your bed for the rest of your life, you take something from it as you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, or a corner of the room that you keep for, the shame corner.
Yes.
The kind of stack of drafts that never moved it.
Yes.
Yeah. Wherever you keep them, you should be proud of them.
Yes, you should. Well, let's flip this question. Instead of the hardest part of your job, what is your absolute favorite thing about being an agent? What do you love the most?
I love the midwifery of it. I love seeing a manuscript in its infancy. Sometimes it's as small as just an idea, and then you watch it grow as you work with the author. You watch it take shape in the hands of the editor, and then you see it out in the world, and it takes everything that you have not to turn to the person next to you, even if you don't know them, and just force the book into their hands. I am immensely proud of my authors and everything they do. I'm talking about, an essay, a short story, a product review, a comic strip. Just seeing what these wonderful creative humans put out into the world. There's just so much joy in that. There's so much joy in amplifying that for them. I think if I had to kind of not call myself an agent and then come up with an alternative title, it would be something like book midwife cheerleader. I think that's more accurate. I think that's the parts of my job that I love, is just being there to help birth the book, and being there to cheer it on.
I love that. And I think this leads really well into my next question, because I think, as authors go into the query process, getting a literary agent and signing with a literary agent can seem like the biggest deal, like the end goal, like, oh, you've signed a literary agent, it's over, like you're done, you've made it, right? And so I feel like with some people there could be a naivety to like, okay, I'm just going to sign with the first person who offers me representation. But I think they want to find, like, it's so important to find someone like who has all the feelings, like what you just said, who's going to be a cheerleader, who's going to be this midwife to your book, this like fairy godmother or father to your book. So what questions do you think authors should be asking an agent on that call to, make sure that they're, just doing what they can to really get to know the agent and their process?
So I think publishing is such an opaque industry that it is a good opportunity to just ask about the publication process in general. I mean, regardless of how much research you've done beforehand, your agent is the best person to explain to you each step from first draft, first publication.
Yeah.
And with that answer, you're going to get a great overview of how the industry works, but you're also going to get a good overview of how your agent will treat your book, the kind of timeline that they see this kind of moving forward through. I also would recommend that you ask an agent what their perfect client looks like. And that's not for you to mold yourself into that ideal. It's there to give you an idea of how the agent operates and what they expect of you. I think that answer should give you a very clear idea of whether you are a good fit or not.
I think that is a really good question to ask. I think I've heard other people say, like ask about communication and all that, that style, which I think is important, but asking them, what their ideal client looks like is a really good one to get a perspective. And then you obviously need to be really honest with yourself. Like, okay, is that me or is that not me?
Exactly. Exactly. And it's not there to, you should never change who you are as a writer, because you're going to run into problems down the road. So don't try and fit into this box that they create on that call, answering that question. It's there to just kind of understand what they see in the client, their perfect client. And that will tell you a lot. I really do think that.
I will tell you so much. My little boy does too. He thinks he's very excited. He does agree. He's saying yes for that answer. Well, Hannah, thank you so much. I have just one last question for you. I'd love to know what you're most excited about representing next. What are you looking for?
So I think there are certain things that are always going to be evergreen on my wish list, and that is adult literary and upmarket fiction with a single kind of striking hook. Authors who play with form, like Ali Smith and Renata Adler, and authors who can make me laugh. I love humor that disarms. I love wit that makes me snort laugh.
Yes.
And most of all, I love to be surprised. So if your fiction does that, yes, please can I read that? In nonfiction, I have buckets of admiration for unabashed nerds. Those experts in their field who can geek out over a specific topic and write about it in a way that is accessible and entertaining. Regardless, of the subject, if your enthusiasm and expertise is contagious on the page, that is the nonfiction proposal that I want to read. I have a particular interest in art and design and food, so extra points if you're nerding out about, I don't know, sans serif typeface, or the history of taffeta, or the science behind a blancmange. I love those subjects. And I love nonfiction books that teach me something new or bring me into a community that I don't yet know about. But they don't sacrifice intimacy in that process. So I love a kind of person-forward, a very voice-driven, intimate nonfiction book.
I love that. I hope that, those all sound wonderful. I don't do a lot of nonfiction reading, but the ones I have read, I'm like, the ones that, you can tell the author was just like so excited and just loves everything that they're writing about is the best.
Yeah, I think if you can fangirl on the page,
yes,
and you can make me fangirl too, it's a brilliant reading experience. It's one that is truly contagious, because you know that once you've read it, you're going to be talking about it to your friend, and they're going to be talking about it to their friend. And even if it's a subject that is so granular and so specific, if you can move in those concentric circles outwards and make it seem universal, and you can appeal to people who maybe don't have an interest in that subject, you're onto a winner there. An infectious reading experience. This again goes back to a good story. If you can tell a good story, that's it.
Yes.
You've won.
Yes, that is the best. Well, thank you for sharing those. Can I ask you an off-the-fly question?
Sure, okay. Yeah.
It's a hard one, so I do apologize. Okay. But I just want to know, what is a book that you've read recently that was like awesome that you can't stop telling people about?
A book that I read recently. I love Ivy Pachoda's These Women. That was a great book. I also loved, and I think that you interviewed her, Diane Zinna's The All Night Sun.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant book. Brilliant book.
That's awesome.
I love both of those. And then on the nonfiction side, I just finished Leila Slimani's Sex and Lies, which is, it kind of offers an insight into the politics that control Moroccan women's sexual lives while remaining deeply personal. You get their kind of first-hand accounts of how to have a romantic relationship in Morocco and what's kind of required of you to suppress. And so it was fascinating, and it was emotional, which is a really great balance to find in a book like that.
Wow, that sounds amazing. That's crazy, but cool. Like, that's something I don't think I would ever, find or search out on my own, but I feel like I would be really interested to read that. Thank you for sharing those. That's always like a hard question to answer, but I love, having people share their favorite books, because inevitably we miss a bunch of books as they all come out every week.
Yes, exactly. And book recommendations I just love a good book recommendation. I love sharing them. I love getting them. Anything to kind of expand myself and expand my friend's self. That's a good conversation to have.
Yes, it is.
One that's entirely about books.
Yes. You can never go wrong with talking about books.
No.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today and answering my questions about queries and just helping me and my listeners get to know you a little bit better.
Thank you, Rose. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Authors and Agents podcast. If you could please rate and review this wherever you're listening, that would be amazing. If you cannot rate and review it where you're listening, please make sure to share about it. Post about it on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. Tag me at Rose Quinney, QUI and NY. See you next time.